Competing directly with Samsung can be a thankless task. Just ask LG, which has toiled in the shadow of its local rival for just about as long as it's been making phones. Even the genuinely good LG G6 struggled to move the needle when pitted against the Samsung Galaxy S8. So now there's the LG V30. It's as much a successor to the G6 as it is any other LG phone, and the V30 continues the no-nonsense approach of that device, while also bringing the upgrades we expect from something in the V series. High-quality audio, great cameras, and unique new video features. I'm Alex with Android Central, and this is our LG V30 video review. First of all, I should mention up front that we're using a pre-production version of the LG V30. LG seeds these early devices to press ahead of their phones going into full production, and while they're usually representative of the final product, this is not strictly speaking a retail-ready phone just yet. We'll follow up with some updated impressions when we get final devices, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates. With that out of the way, let's deal with another really obvious point. Yep, the V30 looks kinda like a Galaxy S8. From the curved corners, minimal bezel, polished metal trim and tall aspect ratio, you might well mistake it for a Samsung phone, at least from a distance. Up close, the differences do come into focus. The V30 has a 6-inch display and is smaller in all directions than the S8 Plus, as well as using a shorter but still pretty tall 18:9 aspect ratio. But it's also flatter, thinner and lighter, and that gives it a distinct in-hand feel. It's actually a bit easier to hold onto than its contemporaries on the Samsung camp. The screen is a P-OLED panel from LG Display, the first in an LG phone since 2015's G Flex 2. Back then, LG's OLED technology was, well, bad. Really bad. But I'm happy to report that LG has made a huge amount of progress over the past 2 years, to the point where the V30 screen is almost as good as Samsung's Super AMOLED. Samsung definitely has the edge here, there's no doubt about that, but LG's latest screen, at Quad HD Plus resolution, looks fantastic and punchy, and unlike some of those older OLED panels, is clear enough to use outdoors in bright daylight. If anything, the display's weakness is in low light. It has an unfortunate tendency to crush shadow detail at low brightness levels, which isn't great if you're watching Netflix by candlelight, or trying to judge exposure in a low light photo. This is an unfortunate holdover from the days of the G Flex 2, and it's easily fixed in software by simply raising the floor for brightness, but that's not exactly ideal either. One reason why you may prefer the V30's panel to Samsung's is because of its curves, or rather lack thereof. You have to look ever so closely to make out the very slight curve of the panel at its edges, but that means you're not dealing with any Samsung-style colour shifting around the sides. The flatter display makes the V30 side bezels more pronounced, which might seem undesirable, but it also makes it less prone to accidental touches around the sides. It remains to be seen how well the V30 will stand the test of time. After a couple of weeks, mine has only picked up minor abrasions, and the use of Gorilla Glass 5 on both the front and the back should make it as resilient as possible for a phone whose surface area is made up almost entirely of glass. The phone certainly feels solid and well put together despite weighing even less than the G6. You could say that its lack of heft makes it feel a little insubstantial, but at the same time it's easier to one hand, and it lacks the awkward top heaviness of phones like the Note 8 and GS8 Plus. Given its 6-inch display, you might expect the V30 to feel like a big phone, but that really isn't the case. The in-hand and in-pocket feel is closer to that of a 5.5-inch device with a 16:9 screen. In other words, you get a big screen, but it's not so massive as to become unmanageable. Again, examples of the opposite include many of Samsung's latest devices. And this is basically table stakes at this point, but yes, the LG V30 is water resistant, rated IP68, so you needn't worry about using it out in the rain. There's nothing at all too surprising in the V30's spec sheet. It's a run-of-the-mill hardware loadout for a 2017 flagship. Snapdragon 835, 4GB of RAM, 64GB of storage plus microSD, and a 3300mAh battery. Now, more phones are starting to push to 6GB of RAM, but I've never really felt like the V30 is weaker for sticking at 4. Apps still load lightning fast, I've noticed no drop frames in the interface, nor have app reloads become particularly problematic. It also goes without saying that Qualcomm's latest mobile platform has more than enough power for whatever gaming needs you might have. Battery life too has been great. We've seen many phones this year with around a 3300mAh battery and relatively large screens to boot, and thanks to more efficient CPUs and displays you can absolutely get a full day out of this kind of battery capacity. The V30 has regularly gotten me to the end of a 16-hour day with around 4.5 hours of screen on time. You're not looking at multiple days per charge by any means, but again, I'm fine with that in this kind of device. And when it is time to recharge, Qualcomm Quick Charge 3 and USB power delivery are both supported here. The only area of relative weakness has been standby time with the always-on display enabled. Overnight, I found the V30 will lose around 10% of charge if the always-on display is enabled or if it's not plugged in, which is more than many high-end rivals. On the subject of charging, it's great to see that there are no longer any weird regional variations in the V30's hardware, like we saw in the G6. All V30s have wireless charging built in and LG's famed quad DAC. As other manufacturers come up with increasingly dubious reasons to get rid of the headphone jack, LG is embracing wired audio, and the results are glorious. If you have a nice pair of studio headphones, you'll really appreciate the stronger output of the V30, to the point where it'll be hard to go back to anything else. And LG's also partnering with B&O Play, hence the branding around the back of this European unit, to include some surprisingly good wired earbuds in the box. Unfortunately though, on-device audio is nothing special, and the bottom firing speaker is just okay. For me, what really sets the V30 apart is its camera setup. The headline spec is a 16 megapixel main camera with optical stabilization behind an f1.6 lens, a first in smartphone photography. The secondary wide-angle shooter has a 13 megapixel sensor like the G6, only now behind a brighter f1.9 lens, and this makes for a powerful photographic duo. Despite having small 1 micron pixels, the V30's main camera takes phenomenal photos. The high resolution and bright lens, plus OIS, will help you capture sharp, clear photos even in low light, with clarity and fidelity to match the Galaxy S8. One thing I've noticed in this early firmware is that V30 will tend towards underexposing night shots in some situations, so occasionally I've had to bump up the exposure a little to compensate. LG has also, thankfully, pared back some of the over-sharpening we've seen in the G6 and many of its earlier cameras, which means more fine detail is preserved with less artifacting. There's a mess of different shooting modes to explore, though, as is often the case with the best smartphone cameras, most of the time you'll just want to stick to full auto. If you want to play around with the creative photo modes though, the manual shooting mode has been updated to include Graphy, a new app with downloadable ISO, shutter speed and white balance presets for different kinds of shots. As good as the V30's main camera is, and it is really good, the biggest improvement might actually be in the wide-angle camera. It still captures a 120-degree field of view, only now with less distortion around the edges than the G6, and with significantly improved low-light performance thanks to that brighter lens and the better post-processing afforded by the Snapdragon 835. Of course, you'll still get better night shots out of the main camera, but it's really surprised me how usable the wide-angle is even in relatively dimly lit indoor conditions. And that's great because wide-angle photography is by far the most fun thing about using an LG phone. Say what you like about portrait mode and fake depth of field, for my money there's no substitute for being able to simply press a button and instantly capture these wider, more dramatic scenes. It's always sort of been implied that the V in LG's V series stands for video, and so it's no surprise to see a bevy of new videographic capabilities in this new phone. The new LG Cinelog mode takes inspiration from the techniques used by professional filmmakers, and it lets you capture footage that, on the surface, might appear more washed out, but it's captured in a way that lets you bring out more shadow or highlight detail when you process it later. There are also a bunch of presets in the Cinelog mode that give your footage a particular kind of look. And these are more than just Instagram style filters, they actually change the way the color is processed, and that can dramatically alter the look of your video. I love the idea of this, but I think it runs up against the main problem of high-end photo features like RAW capture in smartphones. In order to have these high-end video features, you need a great camera to begin with, but a great camera is often so good in auto mode that there's no real incentive to explore these more exotic shooting modes. Personally, I've found the new cinematic mode to be more useful for its point zoom feature, which lets you smoothly zoom into any point in the frame without the jarring motion you usually get from digital zoom in video. So the camera is clearly where most of the software effort has gone in the V30, but it's worth mentioning the handful of other tweaks that lend this phone a bit more polished than the G6 on the software side. Touch response has been tightened up, making the phone feel a good deal quicker, and the V30's haptics are also much improved. Vibration responses now feel much sharper, and nowhere near as rattly as they were in the G6. It's a small thing, but again, a big part of the overall polish of the V30. LG's answer to fans missing the old second display from the V20 is the new floating bar, which is essentially a cross between the old ticker display and Samsung's Edge screen. Tap the little tab in the corner of the screen to bring up app shortcuts, screen capture functions like the new GIF recorder, or music controls. Some of the other functions of the second screen have been rolled over into the always-on display, which gives you quick access to settings, music controls, and notification icons even when the screen is off. For me, this is one of those borderline useful features that I never really got around to using much. There are too many taps and swipes needed to use it properly, and it animates too slowly for it to be a real time saver in any way. Thankfully, LG's made it really simple to turn off the floating bar once you inevitably decide that it's not for you. Speaking of borderline useful, Face Unlock. LG has built out this secondary unlock method, which begins scanning as soon as you raise the phone. It's technically impressive, though also less secure than a fingerprint. And really, with the V30's fingerprint scanner being located in a place you can actually reach, it's just not that necessary. Other software changes are pretty subtle. There are some new widgets, including a larger weather widget, the alternative launcher with its own app drawer has been spruced up, it's no longer just the old launcher from the LG G4, and the software is now based around Android 7.1.2, so not Oreo just yet, but at least you're on the very latest version of Nougat, which brings helpful additions like app shortcut menus in the launcher. All in all, LG's software is still a bit of an acquired taste, but it's slowly creeping in the right direction, and this is by far the most polished LG UI I've seen to date. The LG V30 gets an awful lot right. It would be easy to call it a Samsung copycat, nevertheless the design continues the no-nonsense trend of the G6 with better quality than ever. The display, despite some low-light issues, is a step beyond any previous LG phone in terms of quality. The size is near perfect for me, giving me a big display in a more ergonomic handset than Samsung, and the camera builds on everything I loved about the G6 with better low-light performance, superior processing, and new video tricks that I might not use all the time, but are nice to have all the same. LG's phones will inevitably be judged by the standards of its main competitor, and that comparison is actually really interesting this year. LG has retained all the things that make its phones unique, like high-end video, the wide-angle camera, and the quad DAC, while also shipping with fewer annoyances than its Samsung rivals. The fingerprint scanner is in a place you can actually reach, there's no frustrating animation jank, no Bixby button. So as much as I could praise the great design and camera features, there is another very compelling argument for the V30. In a world of headphone jacks going away and weird screen dimples and $700 phones with inexplicably bad cameras and dumb fingerprint placements and bad biometrics, the V30 is a phone with no BS that just does everything well. And then it goes the extra mile with this phenomenal dual camera setup, and it does all that at a price considerably below many of its main rivals. The V30 is going to have its work cut out going up against the Note 8s and Pixels and iPhones of the world when it launches, but for the moment,